Yes, it's the world this week and our weekly look at the planet, brought to you from our summer perch. We're in the newsroom on the first floor studio at France 24, the world this week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. How are you, sir?
Glad to be here, as always.
I'm waiting your essay on what I did on my summer vacation.
Oh, it worked.
Okay. Oh, dear. So did Vivian Walt, I understand. Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time Magazine. How are you?
Very good. Full of the joys of summer.
The joys of summer. Does Claire Byrne, France correspondent, the French news agency AFP, is she feeling the joys of summer?
Absolutely.
All right.
Never ending.
Never ending. Well, it is a bit, though. The weather is cooling here in Paris. The world this week on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag World This Week. Some describe it as the worst day of Donald Trump's presidency. His former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, convicted of fraud in relation to his services as advisor to the pro-Kremlin former president of Ukraine, while Trump's longtime personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, pleaded guilty to charges of paying hush money to two alleged mistresses of the then Republican candidate for president in 2016. Christopher Dickey, this has been going on since day one, practically, of the Trump presidency, even before, you might argue.
Basically, since the time he declared presidency.
And was it that terrible a Tuesday, or is this just, are people just kind of gotten used to it all?
I think people have gotten used to it, but I think it also, there is a kind of a cumulative effect. I was talking to one of my colleagues yesterday who was saying, you can go back, for instance, on the question of collusion with the Russians, talking to the Russians, and see him say, there was no conversation. Then you can see him say, well, there was a conversation, but it was about adoptions. And it would say, well, there was a conversation, but it wasn't collusion. Then it's collusion is not a crime. It's that kind of progress in Trump's own statements. So after a while, even people who support him, except for the people who are conspiracy theorists and think this is all an effort by the Democrats to overturn an election they lost, which is his line, most people are beginning to think, well, you know, this guy really is crooked.
But the same day, he goes off to a rally in West Virginia and
well, as I said, there
doesn't seem bothered.
No, there are people who follow him as if he were a religious leader of some kind. But the main thing that supports him is not the fanatics who wear the MAGA hats and stand behind him and hold up ridiculous signs at his rallies and shout, lock her up. Why on earth were they saying lock her up in West Virginia? Just because that's an incantation of the Trump faithful. The real thing that supports him is that the economy is doing so well, and that he can point to the stock market and say it's the longest bull market in history. You can debate that slightly, but basically that's true, and that helps him a lot.
Once he digested the news, Donald Trump's first tweet, well, it was directed at his longtime personal attorney. If anyone is looking for a good lawyer, I would strongly suggest that you don't retain the services of Michael Cohen! Exclamation point. Vivian Walt.
You have to admit he's entertaining, and that was, you know, a big draw for him during his presidential campaign. He's always compelling to follow and to listen to, and it's carried him. I don't mean to be flip, but that has actually carried him quite a long way. Added to which, of course, you know, the stock market is in its biggest, longest bull run in decades.
So is what happened on Tuesday a big deal for him or not?
I think it remains to be seen, and it'll be seen in November in the midterm elections. And there are two questions that we have to ask. Does his base care? Probably not. And the second big question is, will those who don't like him show up to vote? And last time they didn't. And we will see if this time they're actually motivated to try and vote in Democrats who could possibly start reversing some of this kind of, unstoppable process that he's put in place.
And the confusion reigns for those of us watching from the outside. There was this interview this week with Fox News, Donald Trump taking aim at his own attorney general.
I put an attorney general that never took control of the Justice Department, Jeff Sessions, never took control of the Justice Department, and it's a sort of an incredible thing.
an incredible thing. Would it be like in your native Ireland if the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, started blasting his own Justice Minister?
I don't know. It's just unthinkable. And it kind of, later on in that interview, he said, I put this guy in here and he was going to be loyal to me. And now look what he's done, sort of like this is the gratitude I get. So there was that theme that we saw when James Comey, in his book, he talked about that, about how Trump, in appointing him, demanded absolute loyalty, that's how he conceives of governance. And, just has no, apparently no kind of understanding of the separation of powers. That very much came through again there in his criticisms of Jeff Sessions and in the way he's been trolling him for the last 24 hours.
And as Viv was saying, we're drawn in by the sort of the entertainment value of it. I hate to put it like that because this is serious stuff.
Yes, I think there is that sense, and the entertainment value, I think, is maybe and kind of growing moral relativism, perhaps, in that BBC was interviewing people in North America, in the States this week, in his base, and they were saying, we don't care if you paid hush money to Stormy Daniels and the Playboy model. We don't care, about what he's accused of. And so there does seem to be, among his base and even among Republicans as well, who support him, 70%, I think his numbers, but Republican voters stand, they just don't really seem to care. So what do you do about that? I think that's the question for Democrats, as to how to make people care about these issues.
Is this part of some strategy that, because he's criticized, as we just heard, his Attorney General. The Attorney General hasn't quit, and Trump hasn't fired him. What's going on?
Part of what Trump does is to float these ideas, his anger, express himself on Twitter, and then step away from it, dial back on it, let it fade away.
And Jeff Sessions is okay with that.
And Jeff Sessions, unpleasant little man that he is, seems to put up with it because he's getting a lot else out of the Justice Department that he wants. This is the thing. Jeff Sessions is pushing through a lot of policies in the Justice Department that he wants. Also, the Supreme Court is going to go the Republican way. Also, the tax bill they got was what they wanted. The Republicans have got a lot of things under this president that they have always wanted desperately, almost as articles of faith. So when he puts out care about any of the other stuff.
When he puts out a statement like the one we see here on the screen, I took control of the Department of Justice, and its actions will not be improperly influenced by political considerations.
Well, apart from the political considerations that made him the Attorney General in the first place, which was to implement a lot of policies. For instance, the treatment of the children at the border was directly related to Jeff Sessions' policies. And he never apologized for that, and is never going to apologize for it. All that is right in line with what Trump preaches and with what the Republican mainstream, much of its mainstream, thoroughly believes in. But remember that all the people who love him in the Republican Party don't amount to 30% of the electorate of the United States. So if there's a turning against him, it could be massive.
One final question, Vivian Walt. It's been interesting to see. Everybody around the world is paying close attention now to U.S. constitutional law and the question of whether or not the President of the United States can be brought to trial while sitting in office, and nobody seems to agree.
I think this is one of the most disturbing things, is that I think for so many decades we've just had these assumptions about the U.S. It's a rock-solid democracy. There's always the Constitution. You can always, appeal to the Supreme Court. There's always kind of, ways to redress things which go off the rails. And suddenly there isn't that certainty. And I think, especially in Europe, the sense feels that there's a sense that you're not quite sure where the limits are.
Right, and we used to have East versus West. That's been thrown on its head. One of those under U.S. sanctions, by the way, for funding a Russian troll farm is a man known as Putin's chef. But while catering is one of his ventures, Yevgeny Prigozhin is not a chef. He's an oligarch. Christopher Dickey, you published a story this week about the murder at the end of last month in the Central African Republic of 3 Russian journalists who were looking into his interests in the CAR.
Yeah, Prigozhin is a fascinating guy because he's one of many oligarchs around Vladimir Putin who essentially do the things that Putin doesn't want his government to do. So one of the things that Prigozhin is allegedly involved with, and everybody seems to think this is just a fact, and it's been reported out by investigative reporters extensively in Russia, is what's called the Wagner Group, which is a mercenary group of former Russian soldiers, a lot of them from the GRU, the military intelligence branch, who have deployed in Ukraine, in Syria, and also in Africa, in Sudan, and especially in the Central African Republic. And what is their business? Their business is to shore up, on the one hand, expansionist Russian policy, but on the other, in a place like the Central African Republic, to take over various mineral resources, which in the Central African Republic, a lot of them are not controlled by the government. They're controlled by one or more of the rebel groups in Central African Republic. And so you've got the Russians in Central Africa in a major way, advising the president, advising the military, training the military, but also working with the rebels and also helping them guard a gold mine at Bambari, for instance. One of the things that's going on, that was going on with those 3 journalists that were murdered, is they were trying to get to Bambari to investigate that situation specifically, and it was along that trajectory that they were murdered.
All right, and precious metals are at the heart of it all in these failed states or semi-failed states. Vivian Walt, you're back from a nation, by the way, that stands to suffer from U.S. budget cuts to the United Nations. Democratic Republic of Congo boasts the world's largest UN peacekeeping force, and while its citizens may be poor, it's home to some of the world's most coveted precious metals. You went to Kovetsi, which is the heart of where they mine the cobalt that we have in our smartphones. And there you found children doing some of the mining.
Yes, I mean, there are probably tens of thousands of children mining cobalt on a daily basis. We were there actually during school vacation. So a lot of kids who go to school during the normal school year actually spend their vacations mining cobalt. And not only is it in our smartphones and our tablets and so on, but in every single electric vehicle. And this is the very big question for what comes next, because as governments start rolling out the big electric vehicle revolution, each one of those vehicles needs about 1,000 times the amount of cobalt in the battery that we have in our smartphones. So there's an incredible global scramble.
And battery
going on.
technology just hasn't kept up, so we still need that cobalt.
It hasn't kept up. Even less so have the Europeans or the kept up, and the Americans are lagging way, way behind. China has very smartly locked up most of the world's cobalt supplies for the next several years. So, and in fact now produce more electric cars than anybody else. But we will face a big shortfall of cobalt unless the engineers invent some new way of making batteries, which so far they're way behind on doing.
In the late 90s, we were brought to our attention because of the horrific civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone of blood diamonds. Is there blood cobalt in our pockets?
There's not exactly blood cobalt. You couldn't say that people are kind of fighting wars over this, but there is an incredible level of corruption in terms of who gets cobalt, how it's mined, who gets the concessions. And, you know, for very good reason, we were blocked and harassed every minute that we were on the ground in the DRC by the police and the local officials who really didn't want us to start peeling back the layers of what was going on in this industry.
It's happening the week that we're having this new, fresh escalation in the trade war between the United States and China. And what we're finding, and you talked about these concessions winding up in Chinese hands, is how it's all interconnected, and we're all complicit to a certain degree to what happens.
Yes, and particularly in Africa, I think in parts of Africa, the scramble for resources, you know, between Europe, a lot of French companies in West Africa, and China is kind of largely gone unreported or underreported anyway for a long time. And China has had a presence in the Central African Republic for a while. So I think that a lot of questions in places like Madagascar, you know, what the extractive industry is doing, and in places like Burkina Faso, there's more and more scrutiny on what, you know, foreign companies are doing and at what price these minerals are being extracted and what price for the local populations. And I think that your reporting and, you know, there's kind of more scrutiny of mining, the extractive industry in Africa and of China and European operations.
Christopher Dickey, we have, you know, fair trade coffee when we go to the supermarket. Should we have, I don't know, fair trade smartphones and fair trade electric cars?
As Viv's article pointed out, there was a very big report by Amnesty International some time ago particularly about children mining cobalt. And there was a reaction to that. And there is an effort to make the provenance of the cobalt a little bit clearer. And I think the majority of the cobalt in the DRC is actually mined by a company that's well known, that you'd visited before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually was returning to this very, very spot in Congo that I'd been in 2 years ago. And Glencore, which is the world's biggest commodities trader, has the world's biggest cobalt mine right next door, all these child miners. The real problem is that even though they mine a lot more cobalt, the fact that there are child miners, terrible abuses going on in other cobalt mines, means that all the companies have to now rethink their strategy about where they get cobalt for, because frankly, it's impossible to know whether your iPhone, your iPad, your Tesla car is going to have cobalt in it that comes from some source that's been mined by children. And if you can't know that, then the companies have to start looking for alternatives. And that's what they're in the middle of trying to do.
All right, when we come back in The World This Week, we're going to be looking at Europe's next existential crisis, coming perhaps from Italy. Stay with us. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Christopher Dickey, foreign editor, is with us. Let's say hello again to Vivian Walt, correspondent for Time magazine, and Claire Byrne of the French news agency AFP. It was the week that Greece exited its bailout program, and while 8 years of budgetary pain are far from over there, Europe may have a new existential crisis to contend with. Its showdown with Italy's new populist government is growing tense fast. This Friday, Brussels responding in kind after Deputy Prime Minister Luigi Di Maio threatened to withhold Italy's monthly dues to the Commission unless other EU nations pledge to take in the 150 so rescued migrants who've been prevented from disembarking in the Sicilian port of Catania.
Let's not engage in finger-pointing. And we also believe that unconstructive comments, let alone threats, are not helpful, and they will not get us any closer to a solution. The European Union is a community of rules, and it operates on the basis of rules, not threats.
Yeah, but the government threatening to withhold its monthly dues, especially so after a meeting to take some of those migrants on board that Italian Coast Guard vessel, proved unfruitful in Brussels.
Yes, they have been coming up with these ad hoc solutions all summer to these boats arriving, which Italy has been turning away, sending them to Spain, or forcing them on Malta, or, you know, reluctantly taking, but on the proviso that they be shared out among Western European countries. And so far, since June and since the Aquarius crisis, when you've had the first boat that was turned away from Italy and left on the high seas for several days, they've managed to sort of get through the summer with these solutions whereby they dock in a country and then they divvy them up. And but this time they don't seem to have come up with any solution. And the migrant crisis, which really isn't a crisis anymore because arrivals in Italy are down 80% this year. They're down really to pre-crisis, pre-2015 levels. It's been political fodder for Salvini and his League party, which were the junior partner going into the coalition government in Italy, and are doing so well out of this migrant crisis that they've now pulled up and are at level pegging with the other partner, which is a five-star movement. So Salvini is winning all the way, it feels, and Europe doesn't really have any solutions.
Let's listen to Matteo Salvini, the far-right leader, who is standing his ground. Here's what he had to say recently.
German NGO ships in the Mediterranean with British, Dutch or Spanish flags that pass in front of Malta and do not stop, then arrive in Italy, is something I will not tolerate for much longer.
Does he have a point?
Well, the boat that is currently sitting in Catania is not a foreign NGO-run vessel. It's an Italian Coast Guard vessel.
But it did cross through Maltese waters.
It did cross Maltese waters. Well, this is what he argues, that it's not, that they were rescued in Maltese waters, should have been theirs to deal with, but they're still sending refugees who've been out there for days, leaving them stranded, and it's really not acceptable. And I think the European Union is getting tired of being held to ransom by Italy. I'm just not really sure what they can do.
Well, they could take some of the refugees, for starters. I mean, look, I don't think, if I were an Italian, even if I hated Salvini, and I think I would, even if I hated Di Maio, who, by the way, he's the other partner, and he's trying to cash in on this with this idea of withholding dues. That's Di Maio, not Salvini saying it. Anyway, on this issue, I would probably support them, because Italy has been just a dumping ground for African refugees, for North African refugees, sometimes for Syrian and Middle Eastern refugees, but they've all been going into Italy without even questioning the legitimacy of their asylum claims. Why does Italy have to pay the price for its geography if there is a united Europe? This is their argument.
And last month there was this long, it lasted for hours, this meeting of interior ministers. It went nowhere. There was another meeting.
Shameful. It's absolutely shameful. Look, there are a lot of big countries in Europe that could take more refugees, including and especially France, which isn't taking them. Germany certainly did its duty. It took 1 million refugees during the height of the crisis in 2015. But Italy is just being used as a dumping ground. It's as if you had, I don't know, there's no sort of good metaphor for it, but it is the place that all of Europe is saying, you hold on to these people, you figure out how to deal with it, and we're not going to help you with it.
Vivian Wald?
I totally agree with Chris. I mean, I've been in Catania, actually, in those refugee centres, and it's kind of shocking. I mean, here is a tiny little place in a community that is not particularly wealthy. It doesn't feel like Paris or Berlin. And the streets, in fact, are crowded with refugees. There is a real palpable sense of the migrant crisis there in a way that there is not in much of Europe. They're the frontline state, and it is all very well for northern European leaders to be railing against Salvini, and certainly, as Claire says, it's a very popular issue among Italians.
So what happens if Di Maio stands his ground and doesn't pay his dues for the month of September?
Well, then you have an EU crisis, and apparently, Italy is headed towards a real kind of economic deadline with debts due, and I mean, they themselves are facing some real tough economic questions domestically soon, within the next month. So, I mean, Di Maio has other reasons for threatening to withhold dues.
So they can frame their many enormous economic problems with this framework of the refugees. Refugees have nothing to do with Italy's economic problems. But Di Maio is a populist representing an absolutely insane party, the Five-Star Movement, and they will try and frame the entire issue with refugees.
This weekend, Ireland welcomes the Pope for the first time since 1979. He comes as times are changing, with declining attendance at Mass, the historic legalization first of gay marriage and more recently in Ireland of abortion. and the succession of pedophilia scandals that have rocked the church throughout the world.
I went to see the last Pope in Maynooth in '79, and definitely I probably won't see another one, so this is my chance again. I love going, yeah. So it's a great opportunity. It's wonderful for our country.
He's a good man, right, regardless if you're religious or not. I think he's a good man. And obviously they've a lot to clear up on the whole child sexual abuse scandal. And I think we're the worst hit of all, arguably, of all nations, bar the States. But yeah, I think it's no harm that he's coming. But it is a different Ireland. It'll be a different tone. I don't think everyone will be jumping for joy. Obviously a lot of people are quite sceptical of generally religion now. But I think it's no harm. I think it's good.
No harm. There's a feeling it's less of a big deal than in 1979. Then
it's definitely less of a big deal. I mean, when he says no harm, that's just a very Irish kind of, let him come. We can't be mean to the guy. Very kind of easygoing Irish kind of attitude. But yeah, I mean, he's arriving into a country, a Catholic Ireland that doesn't exist anymore. I mean,
doesn't exist?
No. A Catholic Ireland is dead. It's in the grave. It really is that it's been that massive. Like the fallout with the church, the disaffection is massive. I mean, there are in 1979 when Pope John Paul II came for a visit, which I remember, 1 in every 3 Irish people went to see him speak. There were 1 million people in a country of 3 million, and over the course of his visit, something like 2.6 million people saw him somewhere on the way. Now they expect a couple of 100,000 tickets have been issued for the event. Not sure that they'll all take them up. So the numbers are halved, and the numbers going to Mass these days in Ireland are down from back in the 70s was around 80%. Now it's around 35%. But more than that, there's a real push. In 1979, there was no contraception. Amazing, huh? 1979, no legal contraception in Ireland. No divorce. Homosexuality was a crime.
Now you have
no
a gay
abortion.
Prime Minister.
Now we have a gay Prime Minister, 2/3 majority for gay marriage and a 2/3 majority for abortion, which I would defy you to find anywhere in the world. It's just been
What's
massive.
that down to?
Well, I think that it's the backlash has been as strong as the faith was, if you like, and that's because of the sense of betrayal has been so massive after all these paedophilia scandals in Ireland. Ireland, as they say, those youngsters were saying, has got to have been the country that was the worst hit by clerical sex abuse, by church-run institutions that abused fallen women and that forced them into almost slave labour, mass graves of babies found at what used to be these mother and baby homes for illegitimate children and their mothers. It's just, it's absolutely ground zero, for the Catholic Church. And so that's why the disaffection, and the pushback has been so strong.
And that pushback is being felt not just in Ireland. There's been what's been happening most recently in the U.S. state of Pennsylvania. And when the Pope on Monday issued a letter urging a proactive approach to abuse within the church, well, one parish priest took his word to heart. From the southern French city of Valence, Father Pierre Vignon started an online petition calling for the revocation of his boss, Cardinal Barbarin, who's accused of covering up the rapes and assaults of a Lyon area priest whose abuses took place over a span of decades. A lot of people are wondering, after that letter, Vivian Walt, what more can the Pope do during this visit this weekend?
I don't think that the Pope has gone nearly far enough. Maybe Claire would disagree with me. I think the one issue that he has not taken on head-on has been the cover-up. It's okay for him to apologize, to feel remorseful and so on, but he hasn't yet explained to the world how on earth these cover-ups have happened for decades. I mean, even I read a lot of news, I'm kind of shocked that we are now uncovering, thousands of cases of abuses years after the first exposés came out.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you go back and you read even parts of the Ryan Report or the Murphy Report, these reports that came out of Ireland in 2009, we're talking about almost a decade ago, they are absolutely stunning. You cannot believe. You'd have to go to the Marquis de Sade to find anything even remotely comparable to that. And we're talking about institutions that control the lives of 30,000 young people with mass graves, with abuses that were described by Sean Ryan, the judge who did one of the reports, as endemic to Catholic institutions in Ireland. And now we're 10 years later. And we've got...
And still unresolved.
And we've had the Spotlight investigations in Boston, and we've had now this in Pennsylvania. There are new investigations opening up. And what happened again and again and again was that somehow this was supposed to be geographically contained. The problem was in these dioceses in Pennsylvania or these institutions in Ireland. But no, what we understand now is that the rot is at the very core of the Catholic Church. And the Pope hasn't addressed that. You can't just say there's a problem with clericalism.
Can he revoke cardinals like the one in France who's in the hot seat right now?
Not only can he revoke them, he should open the door for them to be thrown in prison. That's what it's going to take. It's going to take that kind of purge. I don't think this Pope can do it.
And
I think
possibly, reviewing the issue of celibacy, I think is just, surely this question leads to that.
We have a piece in the Daily Beast today that says, married priests won't take care of the problem because pedophiles, it's a different issue. No, but I think that actually was framed wrongly, because the problem is if you have regular married life for priests, it won't attract the kind of creeps that it attracts now.
All right, and we're going to have to, unfortunately, leave it there. We'll be covering that papal visit. I want to thank you, Christopher Dickey. I want to thank as well Claire Byrne and Vivian Walt. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.